In this lesson, we'll learn how to disconnect or break connections between Hypershade nodes. Okay, great. So if you open up the project file for this particular lesson, what you'll find here, if we jump over to sort of our split Hypershade perspective view, is that I have the exact same materials that we created in the previous lesson. Let me just tap the spacebar here to maximize the Hypershade. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to begin to examine some of these connections a little closer first. So if we select blend number 1 here and we expose its input connections, you can see that very simple shading network that we built for it. Now, if we come over here and examine blend number 2 and click on this button to expose its incoming connections, you can see here that that automatically clears off blend number 1. We no longer have the ability to see both shading networks. So if we wanted to expose the shading networks of all 3 of these materials, all we need to do is select them all. We can drag a marquee around them just like so, or we could shift select them. And if we expose the incoming connections, you can see here we now have all 3 shading networks. If you remember, this particular texture was driving the color for both blend number 1 and blend number 2. Fantastic. So let's go ahead and look at these connections a little bit closer. I'm going to go ahead and let's just start over here with blend number 3. It's only got a single texture connected to it here. So I'm just going to drag these guys out a little bit, and obviously you can see there's a visual difference between the arrows that connect the texture to the material and the Place 2D texture node to the texture node over here. So let's talk about this guy right over here first. So basically what we're looking at here is a thin arrow in comparison to this guy. This represents a single connection being made. And to be honest, the fact that it's green usually indicates it's some kind of an RGB connection that's being made to our material. Now, we know what the arrow indicates, but let me go ahead and show you one way of disconnecting this texture from the material here. Very, very simple, and I use this method quite a bit. All we need to do is simply select this connection. We can click on it just like so. You can see it changes color, or we can drag a little marquee around it to select it. Either way, and just simply hit the delete key on our keyboard. And you'll see as soon as I do that, we've now disconnected that texture from that color input of blend number 3. What you'll also notice is that this little arrow right down here goes from a black arrow in color to kind of an empty color or a white color. So if we middle click and make that connection again, you'll notice that that arrow fills in, indicating an incoming connection. So now again, this is a single connection, and if we mouse over this connection, you can actually sort of see what output on our texture is connected to what input on the material. You can see here, if I mouse over, the little window that pops up says grid 3, which is our texture, out color, which is the output, and then a little arrow to blend number 3, which is our material name, and color, which is the input of blend number 3. All right, great. Let's come over here and look at this guy, because this guy's a little different. Now, this particular connection is much thicker in comparison to this guy over here. And basically, anytime you see this type of an arrow where it's thicker like this, that's going to indicate that there are multiple connections between these 2 nodes. All right? So if we mouse over this guy, again, you can see there, in this case, are 2 different connections being made from the Place 2D texture node to our Grid 3 node. Now, just sort of a tip for you, if you ever need to, let's say, make maybe disconnect one of the multiple connections that are made here, you could always come over here to the Options menu inside of the Hypershade and turn off this Merge Connections option. And now you can see with that option turned off, we now have 2 arrows that connect the Place 2D texture to the Grid 3. And we could come in here and we could begin to disconnect either one of these 2 connections. Now, for the most part, I will leave that option turned on because once you get a fairly complex shading network built, you end up with sort of this spider web of different nodes in your shading network. And having multiple arrows between each node can seem to clutter up your work area just a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that option back on here, just like so. Fantastic. Now let's go ahead and take a look at another way that we can begin to break connections. So if we were to come over here to our blend number 3 material and just double click on that guy, you'll see here that the attribute editor opens. And as we learned a moment ago, you can see here that in the attributes for blend number 3, for the color attribute, we have a connection made. That's because this texture is connected to the color. Now, we can actually break this connection right inside of the attribute editor simply by right-clicking on the color connection and choosing Break Connection here from this little menu. As soon as we do that, notice down here inside the Hypershade, the arrow disappears and our little grid icon to make a connection actually returns. So that's another way that you can actually break a connection here inside of Maya's Hypershade. All right, fantastic. So at this point, let's go ahead and move on to our next lesson, and let's learn how we can begin to assign materials to Maya geometry.